Welcome back, everybody, to the Luke Beasley Show. It is so good to be with you. We have a big, old, fat show for you today. So we'll be doing the news like we always do, and a lot of important stuff to discuss on that front. I just realized I have a humongous bottle of water that was sitting on my desk with its cap off. That would have been horrible if I, in my animation, smacked it off the desk or onto my computer. But then after we get to the news, Jared said fat with a PH or fat with a PH. That's the type of day it is. After we get through the news, I'm going to be bringing on an objectivist, which is in political terms, and he'll likely explain what the distinction is. But a lot of people confuse objectivists with libertarians, like conservative right-wing libertarians. There's obviously like libertarian socialists, but on the small government side. So as an objectivist, he's very small government, and we're going to have an interesting chat. I think we pretty much disagree on most or all, not all, most policy topics. So that'll be really fascinating. And I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, and based on the other discussions I've seen him do with people, I do think it is going to be a rather extensive discussion. Long is another way to say that. So that should be good. Give some time for people to hop on. Hope everyone's doing well. Get my protein shake. Shaken. Can someone in the chat explain the difference between using the term shaken and shook? Is shook ever? I shook their hand. Yeah. That hand was shaken. Interesting. I've never thought about that before. Very interesting. All right, we'll just let people jump on while I'm in the first story. So I'll just go ahead and get cooking. Let's dive in. We talked about previously on maybe a couple weeks ago, the fact that Joe Manchin had seemed to completely sink Biden's hopes of doing really anything, but specifically he said he was not going to support, or a report came out revealing that he was not going to get on board with any big climate bill. Obviously, Biden had originally proposed, kind of at the beginning of his presidency, his Build Back Better plan, which was designed to both implement social programs and also address climate change and infrastructure stuff, kind of a very broad, expansive package. And Joe Manchin, throughout the process, along with Kirsten Sinema, have pretty much single-handedly or dual-handedly with the two of them, blocked this entire process and prevented really, really good policies from getting implemented, and it's been super upsetting to watch. And so another kind of nail was put into that coffin whenever Joe Manchin said, hey, even the smaller stuff that we were debating over, we gave up a long time ago on Build Back Better, but even the smaller stuff, I no longer support. That was what the report was saying about how he was feeling behind closed doors, and it was allegedly upsetting the Biden administration. So I don't know what changed from a couple weeks ago to now, whether maybe Joe Manchin got a lot of backlash, realized that even though he doesn't care so much about the Democratic Party doing good in elections, he doesn't want them to get completely swamped. I don't know why he kind of changed his tune on this, but reporting has come out, and Manchin has come out saying that he is willing to support a good climate bill. It's not amazing, but a bill that's designed to lower carbon emissions, and do some other things. So we'll look at the specifics, but overall, I'm excited. It's definitely not enough. It's definitely not at all close to Build Back Better. You can't even compare it to Build Back Better. All of the awesome social programs and stuff kind of have been given up on, but trying to address climate change is good. And so going from us thinking we were going to get absolutely nothing to this is great. Now, It's just proposed. Manchin has just said he's going to support it. He could pull out at any moment, and we haven't yet heard from Sinema, so she could still block. But assuming this actually goes through, it would be definitely a step in the correct direction. So with that being said, let's go ahead and read about it from The Guardian. Is that correct? Yeah, The Guardian. Joe Manchin, the centrist West Virginia senator and coal company owner who has repeatedly thwarted Joe Biden's attempts to pass legislation to tackle the climate crisis, shocked Washington on Wednesday by saying he will support a bill aimed at cutting planet heating emissions. I just want to say mad respect to The Guardian for in this first line saying the centrist West Virginia senator and coal company owner, because that is something that is not mentioned in mainstream media enough. And it is very relevant when talking about someone who's blocking action that would affect the oil and gas industry if it's someone who owns an oil company, which I think if you're in Congress, you shouldn't have any companies that you still own at all, or pretty much as minimal investment in any different industries as humanly possible so that their only focus is getting the best results for their constituents. But that is a discussion for another day. Continuing on, the $369 billion package has been touted by jubilant Democrats as the largest climate bill ever in the United States and even the world. It still faces obstacles before passing, but the support of Manchin, a crucial swing vote in an evenly divided U.S. Senate, appears to augur well for its chances. So what's in the legislation? All right, so we're going to break down what's in this bill, because I do think a lot of times, one of the things I try to do on my show at least, is when these things come up, at least give a skim through of what's actually in the bill, because a lot of times all that's discussed is the price tag and maybe a few major things in a bill. So then it's kind of a weird reality TV show conversation about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Biden, and they're having meetings about this dollar amount, and now they're bringing it down to this dollar amount, and not really talking about the importance of what's in the bill and how that would either affect people's lives or affect the planet, which in turn would of course affect people's lives. Okay, so the basics of the bill. The climate spending is part of a broader package known as the Inflation Reduction Act that totals $739 billion. The majority of this bill, however, is dedicated to confronting the climate crisis, with $369 billion dedicated to the crisis over the next 10 years. So I'll say, from a strategy point of view, I like that this is a part of an act that is titled the Inflation Reduction Act, because then when talking about your accomplishment, you get to say to the people who are concerned with climate change, we invested in this, that, and the other to address climate change through this particular piece of legislation. To people who are less concerned, you can, strike their ears positively by saying we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, especially if that ends up actually having an effect on inflation. Continuing on, it's part of a reconciliation budget that can only be passed with all 50 Democratic votes in the Senate due to unified yes. So of course Republicans aren't going to be on board with this, so we have to get all 50 Democratic votes, and that's why Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin are always getting all of the attention, because they're the ones who usually block this stuff up. The bulk of the bill allows for large tax credits for clean energy, such as solar and wind power, to allow such projects to go ahead on a grand scale. States and utilities will also get $30 billion to help the transition to renewable zero-carbon electricity. This is awesome. I think we talk about a lot, and it looks like they're doing this. One of the things we did with oil and gas is a lot of subsidies. To this day, we still give subsidies. And for a long time, people have been advocating for, listen, okay, maybe you don't ban the production of certain types of energy, namely oil and gas, but how about you at least stop incentivizing that and incentivize heavily green energy? Because yes, eventually the markets are going to get there, because it's going to be an efficient and kind of the way of the future type energy. And so capitalism will get there, but it's not going fast enough. So you need to give, as the government, a little nudge to the markets, a little nudge to these industries to speed up and move forward and encourage them to do so. So I like that. A new $27 billion clean energy technology accelerator will be created to help advance renewable technology. This is awesome. $3 billion will be given to the U.S. Postal Service to electrify its fleet of trucks, and there will be a new program to drive down leaks of methane, a potent greenhouse gas from oil and gas drilling operations. That's good. You would be surprised how much energy just the U.S. Postal Service uses. A further $20 billion will be spent to promote climate-friendly agricultural practices, and another $5 billion to make American forests better prepared for the wildfires that are increasingly threaten them due to global heating. So I know these are all just kind of numbers being thrown at you. A total multiple $100 billion package investing in climate change. Is it enough? No, we're looking at trillions that we should be investing over the next decade, but we're going from zero. I was expecting zero based on the things we were seeing in the political dynamics in Washington. So getting hundreds of billions of dollars invested in really good options like this is important. I do want to know though, and this is something you'll always hear whenever proposals come out, is what are the specifics? What does it mean to give $20 billion to promote climate-friendly agriculture practices? What does that mean? How is it implemented? That makes a big difference. Continuing on, the legislation includes a tax credit worth up to $7,500 for people who want to buy a new electric car. This is great, which has until now largely been the preserve of wealthier Americans. So that's important. If you want to get the average American driving electric, you have to do a few things. The first is we want the producers of these electric cars to advance the technologies within the car so that it's closer to the user friendliness of a gas-powered car, so you can drive further, longer battery life, stuff like that. But also just purchasing an electric vehicle right now is more expensive on average than purchasing a gas-powered. But if you factor in $7,500 that can go towards that, that's going to make a big difference with who feels like they can buy it. There's also a $9 billion scheme focused on low-income households to electrify home appliances and make dwellings more efficient, more energy efficient. Further tax credits spread out over the next decade will make it easier to buy heat pumps, rooftop solar, and water heaters. Disadvantaged communities that suffer the brunt of fossil fuel pollution have also been recognized, with $60 billion dedicated to environmental justice projects across the U.S. Another important thing, again, how does this specifically get implemented is super important, but it would be a gazillion hour video if we went through all of that. But them trying to address the problem that is caused, where the biggest negative effect of climate change generally is going to hit lower income people, is a good thing that they're addressing that for sure. So getting to the last part I want to look at from this article, when talking about how significant this piece of legislation is, obviously they were talking about in dollar amount, it's, very historic, but of course you have to compare the scale of something to the moment that you're in, and the moment we're in calls for something much larger. So just saying it's historic and massive kind of is oversimplifying, but again, still good. Despite its imperfections, the bill is expected by both its authors and independent analysts, this is humongous, to allow the U.S. to cut its emissions by 40% by 2030 based on 2005 levels. This brings the U.S. close to Biden's goal of slashing emissions in half this decade, which scientists have said is imperative if the world is to avoid a catastrophic climate change. So there's so much more to talk about as it kind of continues to get negotiated and goes through the process. We'll stay updated on it. But overall, a good move if this is true, that the actions taken by this bill would cut carbon emissions by 40%. That would be really, really good. That would make a massive difference. And when looking at the specifics of how this is being funded, it is getting paid for through, top marginal tax rate heightens and things that are affecting wealthier Americans. But we're not, deficit spending, which is a big deal for people like Manchin, not wanting to do that. So it's kind of a win on multiple fronts. And I'm excited to see it. I know a lot of progressives will respond like, ugh, this is not at all what we should have gotten, which I agree with and understand. And this moment calls for something so much bigger. But in the context of how corrupt and how obstructionist Manchin has been, seeing him come out and publicly agree to this package is a positive move. And I think the only way we're going to stay hopeful and optimistic about the future is to recognize when we get wins, even if they're not as big as we'd like them to be. All right, let's check in on the chat. Jared said, I got tired of waiting for Luke to watch the Carter Reagan debate. It's because only you and me would like that. That's why I didn't watch it. But let's see. So I watched one the other day. It was striking that revitalizing the coal industry was a big talking point. Weird. That's crazy. Yeah. Very interesting. All right. Let's just go ahead and jump into our next story. The Biden administration has announced that they offered the Russian government a prisoner exchange. So obviously, I'm sure you know what this means, but what happens between two governments when one government has, is holding captive a citizen of the other country, and the same for that country, they'll exchange either prisoner to get them back to their home countries. But a lot of controversy has come up with this announcement, and to kind of give you without any names or details, the broad summary of why is the person that we now have in captivity, who is Russian, is a much bigger criminal offender and a much bigger threat than the people they have in captivity. Now, the lives of the two people that the Russian government is holding are so important, so valuable, and we want to get them back, of course. But what people are upset about and debating over, so I'll be interested to hear where you guys land on this, is do we want to set a precedent where you can just, on kind of phony charges, arrest an American citizen, knowing that by doing that, you now have the option of trading a citizen who didn't do anything horrible, isn't this big master criminal or a big spy or something, and then trade it for someone who is a big master criminal who really was threatening the United States. So it could set a scary precedent, and that's kind of what's being debated, because of course the families and all of us want these two Americans who, again, they were not doing some crazy crimes, they were not a threat to Russia, but the Russian government kind of, according to the United States government, got them on phony charges, or at least went after them for the purpose of probably doing something like this, having some leverage against the United States. So we'll read about the specifics, but that's kind of the overview. So let's dive in. Victor Bout, one of the world's most notorious arms dealers, could be the key to a possible deal with Moscow to win the freedom of basketball star Brittany Griner and another American, Paul Whelan, according to an exclusive CNN report. So my base level, gut response to this is positive. I'm super glad that this WNBA star and Paul Whelan are able, and I might be pronouncing the names incorrectly, but are able to come home and be safe, and they were not getting enough attention beforehand. So that's amazing. I just kind of wanted to give you the context of why this is such a groundbreaking announcement. Continuing on, a substantial offer was made to Moscow in June, according to three sources. President Joe Biden personally signed off on it. To put it mildly, this is a stunning development. The Kremlin has yet to respond, but if the swap goes ahead, it could transform perceptions of how the U.S. deals with governments who detain its citizens overseas. This is kind of what I was alluding to, making American travelers more tempting targets. It would also be an act of great humanity by Biden to bring Americans home from hellish Russian prisons. So it's kind of that there's two aspects. You're setting a precedent where now Russian travelers who you could pretend did some crime and detain them for that are perfect kind of opportunities from the perspective of some of these more authoritarian governments to now have leverage over the United States, because we'll make trades that aren't equal in the level of criminal on either side, or anywhere close to it. But on the other end, Biden's possibly going to successfully get these two people home safe. So, tough. Okay, continuing. This is one of those problems with no right answer that leaders face. Freeing a prisoner like Bout is a risk he is only He's not only close to Russian intelligence, but could pose a future threat. He was convicted in 2011 of conspiracy to kill Americans, among other charges. A high-profile swap like this might also send a message to hostile governments and bandits around the world that the U.S. will cut deals to get people home, which is a thing that is done, but I get the point. Skipping forward, this particular individual that the Russian government wants back, massive arms dealer, conspiracy to kill Americans, in contrast, as this reads, is notorious. Let's see. So in contrast, the Americans that we're trying to get back is, quote, a WNBA star Griner, who is on trail in Moscow, says she unintentionally took cannabis into Russia. That's what she's there for. She's not some threat to the Russian government. She unintentionally took cannabis into Russia. Whelan was arrested, so this is the other person, in 2018 and accused of spying. Washington contends that neither case has any merit and is highly critical of what it sees as the politicized Russian justice system. So as you can see, and I would not put it past Putin or the Russian government generally to completely fake or way hyperbolize the charges and the actions that they are charging these individuals on. But it sounds like the WNBA star did have weed, but unintentionally brought it in, and they pretended like she's some big weed trafficker or something, and now using that small of a charge to hold her and use her as a pawn in kind of this game. So I'm glad these two Americans are, or at least have a better opportunity of getting home now, because the Biden administration has proposed this. Not clear on if it's going to go through yet. Interesting to see what the repercussions are on this with the precedent that it sets. Excuse me. And also interesting because there has not been significant communication between the American government and the Russian government since the war in Ukraine started. And so this will be the first time that there's more communication between the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and their, equivalent in Russia. So all around interesting situation. I'm hoping the Americans do get home safe. But definitely understand why this is such a big deal and so controversial. How's everybody doing? The U.S. should not be burning coal, says Salem. Wait, no, I got this. Salem, right? All right, let's continue with the news. So there's a race that is garnering a lot of attention in Arizona for the governor position. And the reason is because the candidate that is Trump-backed is going against a candidate that is being endorsed by what we now know is the more establishment, slightly more moderate branch of the Republican Party, people like Mike Pence. And we've seen this in a couple races now where Trump will endorse someone and Pence will endorse the other person. And it's a little bit, what the media is calling it, is proxy races. So it's the battle between the Pence brand of Republicanism and the Trump brand. The main difference between the two is, are you willing to recognize that the 2020 election wasn't stolen? And that's kind of where the big dividing line is now between establishment and Trumpsters. Anyways, so it's between the top frontrunners are Carrie Lake, who is the Trump-backed person, and Karen Taylor Robson. Karen Robson. Let me just confirm. Yeah, Karen Robson. So Karen Robson is endorsed by Pence, and we watched the debate on stream a couple weeks ago between all of the people in the field, but Carrie Lake and Karen Robson, and it's so interesting watching the dynamic between an individual who's full, nutty, unhinged, election was stolen, and someone who's still trying to win voters who believe that, but is also trying to come off as a little bit more legitimate for the more moderate ones. And that's Karen Robson. So we're going to look at a few different things here. The first is seeing Carrie Lake's response to Mike Pence endorsing her opponent. Reading from Mediaite, Republican candidate for governor of Arizona, Carrie Lake, pulled no punches in recent days, attacking former Vice President Mike Pence, who has endorsed her opponent in the GOP primary. Lake, whose campaign has focused on pushing former President Donald Trump's debunked allegations of voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election, has also begun casting doubt on the legitimacy of August 2nd's GOP primary. Okay, so, quote, "I'm telling you right now," this is Carrie Lake, "anybody trying to steal this, first of all, we're already detecting some stealing going on, but you guys know I'm a fighter, right?" So this is something we saw in the debate too. But she's saying it in rallies and all of these things. It is now the norm among whatever you want to call them, the MAGA part of the Republican Party, to just claim that elections are being stolen all the time. Okay, either they win and it was fine, or they win and it was attempted to be stolen, but they still won, but they would have won by more if it wasn't for that. Or they lost and it was stolen and they really won. It's like, and they'll, before the election even happens, say, as she just did here, quote, "we're detecting some stealing going on." I don't know what that means, but we're kind of detecting some stealing. And then more from her, quote, "we're not going to let them steal an election," she says. Okay, so they're trying to steal it like they did in 2020 from her perspective, but we're not going to let them. So now she's perfectly prepped that if she loses, it was stolen. If she wins, she's just such a good fighter that she fought through their attempts to steal it. So this is one of the first interesting dynamic that I was speaking about with these Republican primaries post 2020. I think 2020 and everything that happened because of that election is going to be a big defining moment in the Republican Party's kind of history, because this is when the split happens, and this is when you see the landscape really change, where the biggest litmus test to be a MAGA Republican is, will you scream about the election being stolen? But then, because so much of the Republican Party is MAGA, even more moderate Republicans don't want to clearly say the election wasn't stolen, so they just kind of avoid it, as we're about to watch right here with Karen Taylor Robson, who is the more reasonable, if you want to say that, who's endorsed by Pence.
Let's talk election integrity. Your opponent says she wouldn't have certified the election if she were governor, as Governor Ducey did. Would you have certified the election?
Well, I'm a lawyer. I'm a trained lawyer.
So the question is, as governor, you have responsibility to certify the election results of your state. So even though she's asking in terms of certification, the question is, do you think the election was stolen? That's the question. So would you have stood in the way of allowing the voices of your voters to be heard by citing these fraudulent claims, these fake fraud claims?
And I can't sit here and tell you without having been presented all the evidence. But there has been investigation after investigation. And are there things that need to be fixed? Absolutely. We have to require voter ID and increase penalties for ballot harvesting. But I'm looking forward. I'm looking at 2022 and doing everything I can to keep Arizona's governor's office in Republican hands. And that requires us to look forward and articulate a vision for the future of this state.
So this is the line that I hear from, if you watch any Republican primary debate, a congressional debate, a gubernatorial debate, senatorial, what you'll notice is when the question of the 2020 election comes up, because it always does, because that's the biggest defining feature among Republicans now, there'll always be someone on stage who says the election was absolutely stolen and blah, 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 Donald Trump is actually still should be the president. And maybe you'll have multiple of those, but then you'll almost always have someone who goes, listen, I either, like she said, I wasn't faced with I wasn't shown all of the evidence, so I can't speak to that. If I was in the room, then I would be able to have a good answer for you. But the thing you always hear is, listen, I'm concerned with the next election. Let's look forward and not back. Which, let her continue, and then I'll make the point I'm about to make. Because it makes more sense within the context of her full response.
And that's what I've been focused on.
Well, it's important looking forward, of course. But looking forward is Donald Trump very likely running for president again. So this is an entirely pertinent question. Would you have certified the election as governor?
Again, like I said, I wasn't sitting there, as Governor Ducey was, presented with all the evidence. I have to assume, based on his looking at the evidence, that he did what he believed was right.
You've seen the evidence, you've seen the result of audits, we've all seen the information coming out of Arizona.
So good response from the host here. That's such a cop-out by saying, listen, I wasn't presented with it. The governor doesn't get a big report on, was this election stolen that's a gazillion times more expansive than what we have access to with the audits that were done in Arizona, all of the independent analysis that has been done, all of the court cases that have happened. We have access to that information. It's publicly available. And that if there was enough evidence of voter fraud to make any effect at all on the election results, that would be available to us this far out. That would have been uncovered, presented in some court case, and we would be able to see it. That's how our process, that's how our systems are set up. And that's what we would be dealing with right now. So her pretending like, well, I'm not the governor, so I can't get the secret little file on if this election was stolen, that is nonsense.
He endorsed
and
you.
There are investigations that are ongoing. And I tell everybody, when asked this question around the state of Arizona, my focus is on looking forward. I am not going to get stuck looking in the rearview mirror. I am focused on looking forward and making sure we do everything we can to elect a Republican governor in Arizona, to nominate a Republican that can win in November. That is my focus.
Oh.
So silly. So here's the point I want to make earlier. The answer of I want to look forward and not backwards in response to someone asking you, do you think the last presidential election was stolen? Ballots were flipped. Buckets of suitcases of ballots were shipped in with Biden's name on it. Different governments were hacking into our voting systems and flipping the names that were voted for and all those things. The reason why it's so silly to say, listen, I don't know if that happened or not, but I'm just looking forward, is because if that did happen, you shouldn't look forward. Holy smokes. If that actually happened in America, no, that's all we should be talking about. An election was stolen. People's votes were completely, their ability to voice their voice in our democratic process was completely revoked because it was flipped to the opposite candidate, even though that wasn't the will of the people. No, why would we move? Let's just think about the next election. Well, what if that's stolen, right? So if you did believe the election was stolen, you shouldn't want to go forward. If you had questions about it, why would you want to move forward? That's humongous. That would be the biggest story ever, always, for the rest of time, in terms of political stories. So the only reason you would just want to move forward is because it was a free and fair election. You know that these claims are lies, but you don't have the courage or integrity to go out and say that, because if you do, you'll lose enough support from Republicans where you won't be able to win against someone like Kari Lake. So, weird situation. I hope that she wins because she's better than Kari Lake, but she's also bad. And it also is an interesting dynamic to see Trump versus Pence in kind of a proxy war with who they're endorsing in these races. Interesting stuff. What y'all think? Doo-Doo Bean said, I hope it's not the same prison from Stranger Things. I don't know what that's from. There are multiple accounts in Arizona, including the Cyber Ninjas. Nothing gets past the Cyber Ninjas. Multiple recounts. Yeah, that's the funny thing is they brought in, these wacky Cyber Ninja dudes, or dudettes. Is that even a term people use anymore? They brought in the Cyber Ninjas, and those Cyber Ninjas, from my impression, were right wing. Like they were on the side of finding evidence in Trump's favor was the sense I got. But even if they weren't, they go in, they do this forensic audit, they called it, and find that Biden got more votes than they thought he got before. It was hilarious. All right, let's get through one more story, and then we got a debate coming up. Super fun. One American News, the One American News Network, I think is the full name, has pretty much gotten taken off of the cable news programs or cable news services that they were previously on. So AT&T, and then now recently Verizon, bye-bye. And of course, in their world, this is a big deal. Now, most of their viewership is going to be stripped away. They're going to have to go all online or find another provider. And they were very much propped up by AT&T at the beginning because AT&T wanted some right-wing balance or something like that. But OAN, if you're not familiar, is completely unhinged, even farther right than Fox News, way more dishonest. They got much more prominence during the 2020 election because Fox News called the election for Biden because Biden won. But they kept pretending like the election hadn't gone that way. And so that people who didn't like Fox News for calling the election for Biden went over to places like Newsmax and OAN. But why am I talking about this? So we have a clip to look at of a host on OAN addressing the fact that they're being dropped by Verizon. And in it, it goes instantly from her saying that Verizon is lying about the variables that led to them being dropped by Verizon, to her saying that this is a communist government overtake or something like that. And in prepping for the show, I saw this clip and tweeted out something about, by the way, Luke PP is on Twitter if you want to follow me, the fact that people really don't understand the distinction between government censorship and private companies enforcing their terms of service, or private companies making decisions about who they want to carry on their platform or whatever. And the point that I made was you can be against, for example, Twitter censoring people for spreading misinformation. You can be against that and have a really good argument. You can be super kind of open speech all the time on these platforms is the best policy. That's fine. But what always happens is people don't say that. People don't say, listen, I think that Twitter should be an open platform, so I get mad whenever they censor certain types of speech. No. Instead, people always say, this is a violation of free speech. This is a violation of the First Amendment. This is against our Constitution. This is the government cracking down on free speech. And it's like, but it's Twitter. Twitter's not the government. So let's just watch this clip and we'll continue the conversation. So she's responding to Verizon dropping them.
Yes, for those of you unaware, Verizon is claiming that the Herring Network couldn't come to a monetary agreement. According to them, we demanded more money and refused to negotiate on a deal, which is hilarious because I happen to know that the Herrings actually offered a heavily discounted rate to keep us locked in, and it was Verizon that turned us down. The fact that these telecom companies have the ability to invoke this...
How she does this flip so quickly, I don't know. Watch. She literally says, these telecom companies, blah, 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 and she's talking about Verizon, and then she'll instantly flip it over to the government somehow.
Tyrannical authoritarian power should absolutely concern everyone, regardless of where you stand politically. And I don't care if this is redundant because everyone has their own awakening process, critical mass. But if we continue to allow this to happen, we will all All of us, left, right, blue, red, black, white, gay, straight, the list goes on, all of us. We will all find ourselves walking down a...
I don't know. We'll let her finish, but I don't know if she's reading off a teleprompter or what. Her cadence is super weird. It's like, it's like not giving her all of the lines as she should be getting them, or she's trying to present it like she's reading off a teleprompter, but it's just notes. I don't know. This is weird cadence.
Very slippery slope that will ultimately lead to communism. Just ask any legal immigrant.
Well, did you see that? Communism refers to something relating to the way that the government is set up and the way that the government operates. She just said, I guess the tyranny and authoritarianism, which, okay, of the big telecom is, or whatever, the cable company, you know who she's talking about, the companies that are now dropping them, that tyranny is a slippery slope to communism. To communism, as in the form of government. But the government doesn't have anything to do with what just happened to you.
Who's fled communism and has done the work to come to our country. This is exactly how a government takeover begins.
Did you hear that? This is how a government takeover begins. But she's talking about Verizon deciding not to pay her company, the company she works for, to put something on their platform. That they have, complete decision-making power over who they platform on their service.
And if you love freedom, if you love the ability to speak your mind, to believe in whatever it is you believe in, you love that you can marry whoever you want to marry, or for heaven's sake, even have the ability to identify as whatever furry creature you've made up or whatever pronoun you've...
Okay, first of all, you said if you love the ability to marry whoever you want to marry. I'm pretty sure you're not pro-gay marriage, guy. You probably don't think that. You want to take away those freedoms, probably.
Convinced yourself is your reality. Well, then we all must come together now and put an end to this. I know it's hard for you leftists to wrap your brains around this fact, but if they can cancel us conservatives, then they will inevitably come for you.
Do you notice that? Are y'all getting what I mean about the cadence of her speaking? It's just really weird and segmented and not what I usually hear from people reading off teleprompters. I get reading off teleprompters kind of difficult, but it's more like she's reading one line and then pausing and then, I don't know. Whatever.
It's not going to stop here. This is just the beginning. And I truly don't care what your political beliefs are, because I genuinely believe everyone is entitled to a difference of opinion. In fact, I encourage diverse and independent thought. But it is absolutely crucial that for once we defy the powers that be, that we all come together, set aside our differences in a unified effort so that we can recognize the horrifying danger that lies ahead. If you're watching this and you're laughing and scoffing because you think that you're immune to what's coming, you just wait. Enjoy your freedoms while you still got them. But for anyone that's with me and is willing to contribute to fighting this beast, here is what you need to do. Okay,
so then she goes to how they support. And what she says is call Verizon, okay? What was the first thing she listed off, and then I turned it off. Call Verizon. But you just said that this is a government takeover. This is how a government, push for communism starts. Why are we calling Verizon? Shouldn't we be calling the government? I mean, it's fascinating. And you hear this every single time that a conservative gets canceled off of, I shouldn't say that. Whenever a conservative gets banned from Twitter, they say, this is the beginning of communism. This is a violation of the First Amendment. This is showing that, our government is headed towards authoritarianism. It has nothing to do with the government. That's a private company. Take it up with that private company. What are you talking about? Yes, they have the power to choose who they want to have on their platform. Especially in the case of Verizon. You're saying they're obligated to agree to pay you a bunch of money to have your broadcast be shown on their platform. Why is that? That's their obligation. And if they don't do that, then we're in a communist country. You know what? I like that. CNN, if you don't give me a show on CNN, you are trying to cancel my voice. And you, somehow along with the government, are bringing us to communism. It's so weird. No one's obligated. No private company is obligated to give you a massive voice on their platform. And it seems like a lot of conservatives don't understand the distinction between the private the private sector and the public. Yes, if the government had a free speech platform and they were censoring people, that now you're getting into free speech territory. Now you're getting into First Amendment. But we're talking about Twitter. We're talking about Verizon. We're talking about private companies. Anyways, you get the point. I know this isn't hard for y'all to understand, but you just see time and time again people go, oh my God, I'm getting canceled, and that's why we're becoming communist. No, maybe the society is becoming too censorial. Maybe companies are too touchy with who they censor, all that type of stuff. That's fair criticism for sure. But pretending like this is our government becoming communism when it has nothing to do with the government is whack. What do you think of Elon Musk concerns about Twitter? Sorry, I'm reading comments. I don't think I've been doing this long enough to be able to read and talk at the same time. So what do I think about Elon Musk's, the whole Twitter thing? Yeah, so I don't know if y'all have noticed this. I don't cover Elon Musk. And it's not that I won't. I'm sure a story will come up at some point. Yes, I'm back from my vacay, P-Rabbit. I'm sure, he's the most rich man in the world. I'll probably cover him at some point. But I never am interested in stories about him for a number of reasons. The first is I think a lot of what he does is centered around publicity stunts. Like the whole Twitter thing, I think, was to get himself attention. So giving that to him doesn't feel... I don't really want to do that. Not that I have any sort of authority in like the space yet, but just out of principle, I'm like, I'm not really going to be a part of that. But also, I think we obsess with individual billionaires too much on the left. Like, and the right too. They idolize billionaires a lot of times, but then left-wingers will demonize billionaires. I just think it's completely irrelevant whether a billionaire is good or not. And can someone tell me in the chat, this really must just be my display, but is there any lag? Am I like cutting forward and stuff, or no? Is it completely smooth? Because it looks really like glitchy on mine. Hopefully it looks good for y'all. But anyways, so thanks, P-Rabbit. So I think like blaming the faults of our system on the individuals who benefit from the broken system, I think is pointless. And do billionaires contribute to the broken system? Yes, they donate to politicians and try to keep the status quo. But you can't put, like, for example, a big thing of peanut butter on the ground and then expect a dog not to eat it. Or a bone on the ground and expect a dog not to chew on it. It's the same thing with, individuals pursuing business endeavors. It's like, if your incentive, of course, is to make money for yourself and your company, and you go out, and the way that you can do that is to donate to politicians, and it's to, hire a bunch of lawyers to get out of paying tax, to use all the loopholes, to not pay much taxes, and all that type of stuff. That's just what's going to happen when our system is set up to incentivize that, right? And so I think criticize the system more. Criticize the fact that we have a tax structure set up where people can be billions, have billions upon billions of dollars and still not pay any taxes. That's a systemic problem. That's not an Elon Musk problem, even though Elon Musk seems like like I wouldn't like him in person. He seems super dumb and immature, even though he's super smart, if that makes sense. Like, his humor is horrible, and he supports people that I don't support, and he says really stupid stuff. So this isn't a defense of him or Bezos or anyone. It's more like we shouldn't focus so much on them, because you could snap your fingers, Thanos snap, and have every billionaire disappear, and someone else would fill that spot, because that's how our system's set up right now. So I don't really... it freezes and then cuts forward. I wonder why that would be happening. That's really irritating. So anywho, that is my feeling on that. I just think generally the obsession with individual billionaires is irrelevant because they're just an outcome of the system, you know? And of course, if you're someone who's wealthy and you know if you hire smart people to use the tax system in your favor, completely legally, like, of course they're going to do that. That's not... Of course. We need to fix it so they can't do that, you know? I am so curious about... Oh, we're just waiting for the debate, getting him all situated and stuff. So if I'm randomly stopping, that's why. But I just don't know why it would be glitching out. So yeah, as far as the debate that's about to happen, which by the way, I'm going to edit the thumbnail now. Change this out with a different one. Boom. There's this whole philosophical concept of objectivism. And it came from Ayn Rand. Y'all might have heard about Ayn Rand before. But I think it's going to be super fascinating. What do I think of the Manchin deal? At the very beginning of the show today, I did a whole segment on it. Overall, I'm really excited that at least some climate initiatives are going to happen. And it's not a lot, like I said in the segment about this, it's not a lot compared to what we should have. It's a lot compared to every other metric, like what other countries have done, what we've done previously, and all those things. So I'm glad that it's happening. Wasn't expecting it, honestly. So a good development for sure. I want to watch, let's see. I think we're going to check out, I saw, maybe I could get him to come on right now a little early. Allison is from Huntington Beach, California. She must have hated it there as a devout homophobe. Allison, is that the person we saw in the OAN thing? Yeah, I never understand. A lot of conservatives, I think it's because they genuinely like it, and they kind of just say this stuff for the views, but it cracks me up when conservatives will live in, cities like LA and stuff, and they talk about how horrible it is, and they have the means to move, and I'm like, what? If it's so horrible, why are you living here? you know? Let's watch the Jon Stewart rant. What is the Jon Stewart rant? Jon Stewart rant. Let's take a look at this. Huh. Let's see. What is this in reference to?
So ain't this a bitch? Yeah. Ain't this a bitch? America's heroes who fought in our wars, outside sweating their asses off, with oxygen, battling all kinds of ailments, while these motherfuckers sit in the air conditioning, walled off from any of it. They don't have to hear it. They don't have to see it. They don't have to understand that these are human beings. Do you get it yet? Do we see that these aren't heroes? These are men and women, mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers that we just let stand outside in the heat when they can't breathe. I'm going to read you something. This is beautiful. I'm going to read you something beautiful. You know what? I said a curse word, and I'm sorry about that. That was my fault. Let me say something beautiful. This is a tweet from Senator Rick Scott of Florida from yesterday. It's beautiful. And I'm sorry about the cursing, and let me say something beautiful to make it up to you. I was honored to join the USO today.
It's in reference to the Senate Republicans shooting down a healthcare package for veterans. Gotcha.
And make care packages for our brave military members in gratitude of their sacrifice and service to our nation. And there's a beautiful picture. I wish you could see it. He's standing with a little package. Did you get the package? I think it has M&Ms in it and some cookies and some moist towelettes.
All right, we'll continue this in a bit. But our guest is ready. Or hold up. Cut away from that. Let me get them all situated. Hey. Can you hear me? Hello? Let's see. I can't hear anything. Huh. I got nothing. Can you nod if you can hear me? Like, do something with your head. Oh, I can't hear me either. Bummer. I'm trying to figure out why both of us want to be able to hear each other. Just hold, everybody. We're about to have a wonderful debate, hopefully. So just bear with us. Let me check my Discord settings. We can continue to watch this Jon Stewart thing while I get it sorted out.
I don't even know, honestly, I don't even know what to say. I've been coming down here 10, 15 years. I'm used to the hypocrisy. Christina Keene will tell you from VFW. She sat in an office with Mitch McConnell and a war veteran from Kentucky, and he looked that man in the eyes and he said, we'll get it done. And he lied to him. Because Mitch McConnell yesterday flipped. I'm used to the lies. I'm used to the hypocrisy. Senator Pat Toomey won't take a meeting with the veterans groups. Sends out his chief of staff. I'm used to the cowardice.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Make sure you're not muted.
I've been here a long time. Senate's where accountability goes to die. These people don't care. They're never losing their jobs. They're never losing their health care. Pat Toomey didn't lose his job. He's walking away. God knows what kind of pot of gold he's stepping into to lobby this government to shit on more people. I'm used to all of it, but I am not used to the cruelty. They passed it. June 16th, they passed the PACT Act. 84 to 14. You don't even see those scores in the Senate anymore. They passed it. Every one of these individuals that has been fighting for years, standing on the shoulders of Vietnam veterans who have been fighting for years, standing on the shoulders of Persian Gulf War veterans fighting for years, Desert Storm veterans, to just get the health care and benefits that they earned from their service. And I don't care if they were fighting for our freedom. I don't care if they were fighting for the flag. I don't care if they were fighting because they wanted to get out of a drug treatment center or it was jail or the army. I don't give a shit. They lived up to their oath. And yesterday, they spit on it in abject cruelty. These people thought they could finally breathe. You think their struggles end because the PACT Act passes? All it means is they don't have to sign.
This is really heavy. And coming from, I don't know what the Democratic voter situation was, but coming from Republicans who pretend to be pro veteran is crazy.
Can you hear me?
There we go. I can hear you.
And now you should be able to see me too.
Look at that. Beautiful.
All right.
Here,
Hello,
let me-
everyone.
1 second. Hide self view. Bring this over here. Throw that up like that. Close, close. Okay. Let me get our frames kind of equal.
While you're doing that, let me grab one thing from the room next door. I'll be right back in a sec.
Cool. All right. Everything's good. You're getting some haze from the chat. Oh, he's not plugged in. Whoops.
All right. Let me grab my cough drops because I mentioned I had a cough, and I don't want to cough in the middle of this if I can help it. So.
Gotcha, no problem.
Here.
All right, well, thank you so much for being here. You want to introduce yourself to the good people and give a little summary of why we're chatting today?
Yes, my name is Dan Norton. Sorry to... I have a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/DanNorton1. I'm a supporter of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. It's a philosophy of reason, egoism, and capitalism. So that's a little nutshell of the positions that I support, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. So to kind of preface it all, for the audience, this is super reductive, but to give a sense of kind of like where is this conversation going, and why do we feel like there's something to debate about. A lot of people compare objectivists to libertarianism. Obviously, I understand the distinction, even just one being a philosophical lens and one being a political lens. But I do think there seems to be a lot of overlap, even though I recognize a lot of objectivists that I've heard from don't like being called simply libertarian. But to give a sense to the audience, definitely a super, super limited government type belief system and all that good stuff. So to give you kind of a feel for where I wanted the conversation to go, I'm not so interested in getting super abstract. We can go there just to kind of, so you can be able to say your piece on what you believe in case anyone's interested. But I'm not too interested in going so abstract and philosophical that we're detached from real day-to-day issues. So you'll notice I'm going to want to keep bringing it back to, well, how does that apply to this set of issues or these certain political topics? So that's kind of a warning on that. But with that being said, I'll just kind of start firing stuff. If you have any big points you want to make, just say, this is unrelated, but I want to make sure I get this in. No problem at all. But initially, I watched a little bit of one of your conversations with someone else and heard you say that you're kind of someone who believes that taxation is wrong / like a taxationist theft person. You want to give your thoughts on that?
Sure. Just since you mentioned libertarianism, I can just say a couple words on that in case anyone wants to hear about the difference between objectivism and libertarianism. So one big difference is that objectivism is an entire philosophy. It's not just a political philosophy. So it has views in metaphysics, the basic nature of reality, epistemology, the basic nature of knowledge, views in ethics. Ayn Rand is pro-egoism. And then on top of all of that, you get to her political philosophy. So she has a very robust foundation that underlies and gives rise to her views in politics. It's not just a free-floating kind of system, whereas a lot of libertarians, they just start with the politics as a kind of groundwork right there. That's their axiom, divorced from all the underlying framework which Ayn Rand sets in place. And I think that's one major difference. It's an entire philosophy. Another difference is that a lot of libertarians, they are also anarchists, so that they don't just want a limited government, they want no state at all. And that's definitely not Ayn Rand's view. So some libertarians, they do want a state, so there's variation there, but just want to make it clear that objectivism is definitely not anti-state in the sense that it's thinks there should be no state at all. It's just anti-statism. They don't think the state should be all powerful and dictating people's lives. People should have individual rights and decide how to live their own lives. Right. So that's just a little.
I will say, I heard you say that point. I don't think many mainstream libertarians these days are anarchists. I think anarchists are anarchists, but I hear what you're saying, and just think most libertarians are kind of like small government, except for on some things, depending on the particular libertarian. But regardless of the comparison between the two, from now on, I'm totally great just going forward as, objectivist purely.
Okay. Or at least heavily influenced by objectivism. There might be some small things where I differ, but that's fine. So you had asked about taxation Yeah, I do think taxation is wrong. I think it's immoral. I think it's a violation of people's rights because it coerces people, and I'm against coercion. Ayn Rand is against coercion. So she thinks that people should have a right to what they produce, and the government should not have a right to coercively take that money away under threat of sending you to jail if you decide you don't want to pay your taxes. She would say that's a violation of people's property rights. So yeah, I am opposed to taxation as immoral and a violation of rights.
Right. So then the obvious question is, there are things that a government very effectively provides. I don't know where you stand on different things, but in my opinion, at a basic level, infrastructure, being able to have roads that are already, pre-provided for you, a police department, a fire department, education, all those types of things that even the most conservative people I talk to are usually like, yeah, that's for the good. And that's why most people, I think, accept taxation. We'll get to coercion kind of being antithetical to your whole view in a second, but just how do you respond to the fact that, okay, then how do you do anything with a government?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that for over 100 years, America didn't have an income tax. So it's not like the country couldn't survive without an income tax. There were some tariffs at the beginning of the country. There was a little bit of taxation in the 19th century in the Civil War, but then that was repealed and it came back a few decades later. But the country grew tremendously in the 19th century. It was an era of tremendous progress. Millions of immigrants came from Europe to this country.
There was 100% mandatory taxation throughout that period.
It wasn't until 1913 that there was an income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment. Prior to that, there was little to no taxation. And when it got started, most people, they were paying 0 or only 1% on their incomes, and now we're up to 30% or 40%, depending on your bracket. It's vastly larger. So it's not like you need taxation to run a country. It was a change that came about later in our country's development. But there are voluntary ways to finance the appropriate functions of government, which, by the way, are far fewer in Ayn Rand's view than many people take them to be. So the only proper functions of government, according to Objectivism, are police, military, and courts. In other words, the functions that protect people from force. So you have police to protect you from domestic criminals. You have a military to protect you from foreign invaders. And then you have a court system to peacefully settle disputes among people. But aside from that, there's nothing else for the government to do. I mean, there is a legislature to create laws, but the vast welfare state
we'll definitely
we have today
just
doesn't exist.
Next point will be even for those things, how do you pay for them? But before we go to that, in the pre-income tax, there was taxes on commodities and stuff like that. I recognize that the government was much smaller and more limited, and so then as people wanted more provided, you have to buy in more, in the form of taxes. So then different ways were introduced, and definitely I agree that we definitely pay more in taxes now, but there was definitely mandatory taxation when you're purchasing items, for example.
Yeah, I don't know all the history about what excise taxes or duties or imposts there might have been. So
and on properties,
I'm not doubting that there were some coercive elements. I'm just saying it was vastly smaller, so you don't need a vast regulatory taxation apparatus such as we have today. There is a way to finance government with no taxes, in my view. So I think if the founding fathers were entirely consistent, then I think they wouldn't have had taxes. It would have been entirely voluntary. But I think there was an
so
element
then break
of
that down.
coercion.
What's an example of voluntary? Like a real, not, oh, this is fun in fairy tale land, but like, how would you fund very expensive programs such as the military purely through voluntary means without taxing people?
Well, for the military, I think it's important to have a good foreign policy. And if you have a good foreign policy, then which means you stand up for the rights of Americans and you defend the rights of Americans aggressively, then I think military expenses aren't going to be that much. You're not going to be fighting trillion-dollar wars like in Iraq to spread democracy to the world. That's not a proper function of the American government. It's not about protecting Americans' rights when you go to Vietnam or something to save some Vietnamese people or whatever from communism, something on the other side of the globe. the only proper function in the military is to protect the rights of American citizens. So if you have a properly restricted foreign policy, then it's going to be much cheaper to fund, and no one's going to want to fight us. I think we're just going to be so powerful. I mean, we already right now have the most powerful military in the world, and I think we'd be even vastly more powerful if we had a stronger foreign policy. I think we're far too weak today.
But we have such a dominant military, and nobody wants to mess with us because we spend trillions of dollars every few years.
I don't think it's necessary to spend as I mean, like I mentioned, the Iraq War is, I don't know how many billions.
No, there's tons of I totally agree with you of like offensive, completely unnecessary situations where we end up spending, I think you're about to say, trillions of dollars in wars that were not necessary. But let's say you're in the build up to World War II. That's going to be billions upon billions of dollars dumped into your military. And if you do want a powerful military, that means you have to invest in a bunch of equipment. I'm talking billions to trillions of dollars of weapons and training. And right now we have, more than 1 million people in our military being paid to be in our military. And so there's no way either you don't want a strong military or you have to invest a lot in a strong military.
I think people will invest what's needed to defend freedom. I mean, it's in their own self-interest to defend freedom. People were willing to risk their lives.
Through like donations?
Donations is one mechanism. I have a video talking about voluntary ways of financing a government in a free society. Ayn Rand also has an essay about this. Another idea, lotteries, this is one way that's been done historically, which has actually been used by some places. You can have state-run lotteries. An idea that Ayn Rand discusses is paying money to the government to enforce contracts. So if you want to have a contract with someone and then have the government enforce that contract, you could pay a fee to the government. So if there's a breach of that contract, then the government would step in and enforce that. I've heard people say the government could just invest the money it gets in the stock markets, or mutual funds, and then you're going to just build up interest based on the investments. So that's another kind of passive way of getting money.
It's interesting because while that sounds like, oh, that's cool, you could have people donate. First of all, who, if they didn't have to, especially if you're tight on money, would just contribute free? Like, we see billionaires, even people who would have the freedom to give a lot of money, go through everything humanly possible to keep every dime of their wealth through hiring, teams of lawyers to work the tax system. The idea that you would get enough money to fund all of these, even while limited, still pretty expansive programs, such as the military or police departments, through like people donating or people buying lottery tickets, and then that money going towards investment in the economy. I think that's silly, but I don't really, because it's too much of a hypothetical, don't really think us arguing is going to get us there, except for me thinking that would never happen. No one ever donate, and you thinking they would. But that does bring me to like thinking of hypotheticals, where, for example, the government's investing their money in the stock market. The stock market crashes. The whole economy collapses, as we've seen happen many times throughout history. What oftentimes, every time, gets us out of horrible crashes like that is the pumping of money into the economy by the government. So if that's not a part of your worldview, and the way they're making money is in the economy, what happens when the economy collapses?
I'm just taking some notes here so I can keep track. I just want to mention a few points going back to this segment on, you think it's silly, no one's going to pay for this. I think it's important to remember that in the American Revolution, people risked their lives. It was a volunteer army who fought against the British. So if people are willing to risk their lives for the cause of freedom, why won't they risk something much less, which is just some money? I think it's in people's interest to fight for their freedom, risk their lives as necessary, and donate money. And people have done this. And as to making donations, I mean, people give lots of money today to charity, even on top of all the taxes that they're already paying. So I think if there weren't so much tax, people would be more able and willing to donate money. I certainly would be. If 50% of my income is being forcibly taken away from me by the government, I'm going to be much less charitable than I otherwise would. I think it's conducive to benevolence and goodwill towards other people if you're not being coerced. If you are being coerced, I'm not as likely to want to help you out. But if you ask kindly, I will much more be willing to help you out voluntarily.
It's the same thing as like people who say, in a world where there wasn't expansive government programs to help the poor, that people would just step up and help the poor. It's like, well, why hasn't that been happening then? If people are just going to...
It has happened. If you look at the history of the 19th century, there are things like mutual aid societies.
Well, of course. Okay. Much of my family is involved in helping people all the time. So people do it. I'm saying not anywhere close to us snapping our fingers through Social Security and demolishing, elderly poverty and stuff like that. We can make differences, but not eliminate problems through expecting people to voluntarily be charitable.
I mean, I think people are going to be much better off if you have a free society than if you coerce. I mean, when you coerce, you're taking money out of productive uses. I think very few people actually need assistance from others in order to support. I think it's a tiny, tiny fraction of people who can't support themselves. You don't need masses and masses of people on the dole. I mean, if we're talking about people with Down syndrome who can literally do nothing, or even them, I've seen people with Down syndrome working at grocery clerks or grocery stands, bagging groceries. So even them, there's a way for them to do something productive to support themselves. I think it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, well under 1%, I think, who need others to help them out. And for that tiny percentage, there's going to be plenty of charity to help them out.
So if it sounds like we're in a time that you liked more, why were all of these problems prevalent enough to where people through our democratic process advocated to have a more expansive government? If previous to income taxes and stuff like that and larger welfare programs, people were just magically making money, providing for themselves, giving charitably, why is it that there were clearly all these issues that people screamed at the government through our democracy to address?
I think that's a good question. First of all, they weren't magically making money. They were making money because they had freedom and opportunity.
I should say magically, there weren't as many people who... Sorry, I should say magically, everyone had found out a way to make money. The finding out how to is the magic part, not the making money.
I don't think it's magical. It's a free society. It's a free market. If you allow people freedom, opportunities will develop.
Figure of
There's
speech.
nothing magical about it. But as to why the government eventually grew more expansive, like in the progressive era and the New Deal era, I think that's probably due to influence of German philosophy. There's a book called the...
But if the problems are going to be solved through a freer market, then why were the problems there in the first place? They're not going to make a government program to solve a problem that's not there. Clearly, people were... I mean,
they were getting better. The standard of living was improving throughout the 19th century, and I think it would have continued to improve, and it has continued to improve, but at a faster rate than it has. I think we might have flying cars by now, and much better technology than we do currently. If we had stayed consistent with that 19th century model of limited government. So I think it's held us back to shift away to the more government intervention model.
We've had massive growth and innovation throughout the last 100 years.
Not nearly as much as I think there could have been. I think there's been stagnation in some areas. I mean, there used to be we've gone backwards in some ways, like supersonic jets. We used to have that, and then they went away for a while. I know someone, actually, I think maybe an objectivist, who's working on a company called Boom, which is bringing back supersonic jet travel.
I know someone who works for them. That's crazy.
Okay. Now, in areas which are much less regulated, like the computer fields, we have seen much more progress. So, tremendous progress in the computer industry, cell phones, internet, that sort of thing. But in more regulated industries, I think we are stagnating more.
So this brings us to a perfect thing that always comes to my mind. When I've only, I think, debated with the libertarians primarily, but they similarly had the beliefs that you do. So regulation is something they always zero in on. And most of them, every time I pitch a regulation, it's like, okay, well, maybe that one's okay. Maybe that one's okay. Are you saying that genuinely, or like the government should do policing to protect property, life rights and stuff like that, military, and the third one you said?
Court system.
And the court system. And literally have no involvement in any other space?
In terms of regulating, that's correct. Yeah, it shouldn't be regulating, because regulating is a form of coercion. You're forcing someone to wear a seatbelt. Roads should be private. That's another thing. Forcing someone to get a license from the government in order to practice medicine. Forcing companies to adhere to certain OSHA regulations, etc. There is fraud. There is such a thing as fraud, and that's not permitted. So if you engage in fraud, if you falsely advertise a product, like if you put on you're a food manufacturer and you say this has 10 calories per serving, but it actually has 100 calories per serving, that's not legitimate. You can sue someone for that. You take them to court.
Yeah. So let's take the FDA. There's so many fun ones. Let's start with the FDA. So, as long as you're not saying it's 10 calories and it's really 20, let's say it's just horribly poisonous to you. Nowhere on it does it say it's not poisonous.
No, poison is a form of force. That's like coercing someone. Instead of like sticking a gun at someone's head, you're like, I don't know, shoving poison down someone's throat.
But there's no regulatory body that's preventing companies from cutting corners, allowing terrible things to be put in foods, etc.
No, it's the free market and the court system. So there's competition. I mean, if you kill your customers, you're not going to do well for your business. It's not good for your business to kill your customers, first of all, or to even harm your customers. You get a bad reputation.
That's not true at all. Look at the opioid industry.
What? Tell me about the opioid industry.
Like,
I don't know.
Companies have made billions upon billions of dollars selling drugs, painkillers that get people hooked and way too often lead to people overdosing. They're killing their customers, and it's, gotten them into a lot of trouble. But clearly, even whenever you understand you're going to get a really bad reputation, there's incentives there when you can make tons of money and then bounce.
I don't know much about the opioid industry, but for one thing, just speaking more generally about drugs, I think drugs should be legalized. It's wrong for the government to criminalize them. As long as you're only doing harm to yourself, then it should be legal, like prostitution as well, alcohol. There shouldn't be like prohibition for forbidding people from taking drugs that they voluntarily choose. It's not to say it's good things to do, to take drugs or alcohol, but people should have the freedom to do these things. So with opioids, maybe there are some legitimate uses. I don't know if you're a cancer patient or whatever.
Oh, there's tons of legitimate uses. I'm just citing that as an example of a company harming its customers, but it still happens. Like, because you made the point that, well, no, you don't need the FDA regulating all of these products because companies will just self-regulate because it'll help their reputation. And I'm saying clearly that's not true, because we see examples now, even when there is regulation, where they still will do harmful things to their consumers.
Well, we don't have a free market now, so I don't know if now is a fair example to point to for how it's free market doesn't work.
Dan, come on, you get my point. You have to understand what I'm saying. If they're doing it now when they aren't even that free, imagine if they were completely free.
I need to know more. So you're saying the...
Well, like the opioid epidemic, right? A lot of people overdosing on opioids.
Very little, like almost nothing about the opioid epidemic.
So people a lot of times, either because doctors got encouraged, paid off, or just genuinely had some horrible, medical incident happen. They need opioids to get through the pain. Manufacturers of these opioids make them, knowingly produce them to be very addictive, and massively advertise them, massively push them on doctors, so that people will get hooked on them after some sort of medical operation. And that has led to thousands of people dying from opioid overdoses.
Well, what is the state of knowledge about opioids? I mean, do you know do people know, or do they have a way to gain access to knowledge that would tell them that, if I take this, there's going to be a risk of me getting hooked on this thing. So I have to weigh, what are the risks? What are the benefits?
Totally. You can look up all data on all different drugs, very publicly available.
Treat people as adults and allow them to make these decisions and say, is it worth the risk to me? Give the potential benefits of taking this. Is it worth the possible risks, the side effects that might come with it? And then you let people decide. Because
I would rather violate my no regulation belief and save a bunch of people's lives and just have some government regulation than...
Well, it's up to them to save their own lives. How about that? If they want to.
Because I think
societally there's a risk I might get hooked on this and maybe bad things could happen. So maybe I should really think hard about whether I want to take some of this to begin with.
Yeah, I think
not let people make that
societally
choice?
it's very fair to recognize that it's not reasonable to expect everyone to make the right decision all the time forever. And so putting easy guardrails in place where when people do slip up, they don't end up dying. An example of that is seatbelts. I, as someone who's not always making the best decisions all the time, have driven with my seatbelt off, but because it's required, I tend to wear it on. And if I got in a car wreck, that could have been the thing that saved my life. So even someone who thinks of myself as intelligent, thinks of myself as being very thoughtful with the decisions I make, still probably would wear seatbelts much less if it wasn't a law. And that could have cost me my life. So there's easy regulations you can put in place that save people's lives or make them better, that don't violate people's freedoms in any significant way.
Well, people should be free to be irrational. I mean, it's not the government's place to force people to be rational. There's all kinds of things that are irrational. Like I think religion is irrational. Do I want a law passed that forbids people from going to church or the mosque or the synagogue? No, I think they should be able to do that. Likewise, I think it's irrational to drive without a seatbelt, at least if you're going at a high speed. But should people be forced to do that? I don't think so. I think they should be treated as adults, and then it's up to them. I think it's wrong to treat adults as children and then coerce them. That's imposing your beliefs on them, and I think that's wrong.
Okay, so I think the underlying thing I'm realizing is for some reason you have like a deep belief in freedom over even what I would characterize as like meaningful freedom, which is your life being meaningfully protected. So an example of this is building regulations, like when I go into a high rise, I'm not worried it's just going to collapse instantly because I know there's an extensive process to get permitted and all the regulation hoops you have to jump through to build a building like that. In your world, there would be none of that. So as we see in countries that have less regulations on buildings, we in the United States have much less disasters where buildings fall down. That's why that one in Florida was such a big deal a year ago or something, compared to less developed countries that are less organized in that sense, that have more buildings just randomly collapse.
Well, U.S. is more free than most countries in the world, so I don't know if pointing to countries is helping your case that putting more regulations is.
Other countries have less regulation than us on building codes for sure.
Well, what about there's also history of how long has the free market been able to operate in these countries? Have they developed?
But that's okay. Are you saying that as an adult, I would have to research the building that I'm about to walk into to find who built it, research to see if they're credible, to make sure that I know the building I'm about to walk in isn't going to collapse on me? Because I like being able to walk into any building and knowing, hey, if this got built here, it had to be approved by a governmental body, and that makes me feel safe because it's somewhat, stringent.
I don't think there's no, to use the word magical, there's no magical government stamp of approval that's going to protect you. I think the profit motive protects people. As I said before, it's not in your interest to kill your customers.
No, but that's wrong. Oh, but it is though, because sometimes it is. You see so many, literally the entire 2008 financial crisis was because they were making bad decisions that eventually were going to harm their customers, but it made them a lot of money in the short term. People do prioritize short-term profits over long-term, health of their customer or safety, whatever. That's just how we see time and time again that happens.
Here's an example that came to mind. Think about all the companies that recall products, like if Toyota or whatever they find there's some defect in their brakes. Do they just ignore that? No, sometimes at huge cost to themselves, they'll recall the product because they don't want their customers to suffer, and it'll damage their reputation tremendously if they don't take actions like that. Or some bird goes in a toothpaste factory and it flies into the tub, and you get a few feathers into like millions of gallons of toothpaste, and they flush the whole thing away and they announce it to the public, put out a press release to show how concerned they are about the safety of their customers.
That's an example of a company doing good things, and that doesn't make a rule, though. I just showed you the exception showing that the rule is false.
Well,
there isn't a rule that companies just do what's best for their customers.
But there's an explanation.
The entire fast food industry would not exist if that was true.
No, fast food. If you're, I don't think people know that fast food is not the healthiest kind of food you can eat, but I don't think, just like religion, I think that's unhealthy for your mind. But that doesn't mean it should be outlawed. Likewise, I think we have to treat adults as adults and leave it up to them to make responsible decisions about.
Well, I'm not saying we should ban fast food. I'm saying I can list off a bunch of examples of how companies, what their interest is profits. A lot of times short-term profits, and we have a massive handful of examples. 3 have been listed so far of companies doing things, even whole industries doing things that are not in the benefit of their consumers, that harm their consumers significantly, but cutting corners or whatever they could do to make more money is oftentimes the way they go. Not always, because sometimes, like you're stating, companies are interested in their long-term reputation, stuff like that. But it is a characteristic of many companies that operate within a capitalistic system to try to make a bunch of money in the short term and cut corners to do so, leading to their consumers being harmed. And so then I'm saying, in some scenarios, I agree with you. Fast food, is that the best health decision for you? No. Do I think people should have the freedom to make it? Yeah. I mean, is there lines? I think regulating like how much sugar in the drinks and all that is fair. But generally, you can recognize fast food's bad for you, but still let it exist, as you said, with alcohol as well and all those things. But when it gets to such an intense level, like, and this is just societally we choose where the line is, like building codes, where I am willing to roll the dice on my decision making with what food I eat and the long-term effects of that. I'm not willing to roll my dice on if I walk into some random building and haven't done my due diligence on who built it and get crushed.
Yeah, I think it's the same principle. I think the same thing that protects you in the case of food is going to protect you in the case of buildings. I don't see a principal difference there. I mean, it's not in the interest of the food company to kill you, and it's also not in the interest of the building company to kill you. And you've mentioned short-term profits a couple of times. And I think the word short term is key there. You're not going to do on the long term if you cut corners. The free market is what weeds those people out, those fly-by-night companies that do try to engage in bad practices and take advantage of people. Those people get weeded out. That's what the free market is excellent at. And we don't have a free market today, by the way, because there is so much regulation. I think actors like that would get weeded out much better if we didn't have regulatory apparatuses. I think Bernie Madoff might be a good example here. He was caught eventually, but I think he could have been caught a lot sooner. I think it was someone I believe wrote, I think I heard like 3 times to the SEC about Bernie Madoff before he was actually caught. But the SEC is so busy looking over the shoulders of people who are innocent, who there's no reason to suspect or engage in any kind of fraud or bad acting, that they're not laser focused on the criminals. So it takes longer to weed out the Madoffs, et cetera. So I think without regulations, if you restrict the government to doing exactly what it should be doing, it'll do a better job at it.
So then, because every time I hear that well articulated, it's like, huh. And then 1,000 examples come to mind that prove that not to be true. So the EPA, for example, one of the things that companies do a lot, which is not in the benefit of society, but they do it anyways, is they dispose of their toxic waste in irresponsible ways. That's how a lot of pollution is caused. So let's just use like an example that has happened, but I might tweak the details just for hypothetical. So a factory's on a river, let's say, and they produce some product that produces toxic waste. And the easiest thing for them, quickest, costs $0, is to dump all the waste in the river. This is a real example, dumping toxic waste into bodies of water. Then that waste goes down the river and harms people's drinking water. There's no regulatory body that says that's not allowed, prevents that, but it's absolutely something that companies do and would do in any world in which they're allowed to.
Yeah, this is why I think property rights need to be well defined, including rights in waterways. So right now, there's a lot of public lands. I don't know how much. I think I've heard like over 50% of land in the government, like especially if you go out in the western part of the country, is public lands. But if we clearly define rights to things like rivers, then you can say, look, you're not allowed to stick your waste in this river when it's going to flow right down and stream into my section of the river. But if you just have these commons where no one in particular owns the land, then you can run into these sorts of problems. So I think the solution to this is to clearly define property rights, and then if someone violates your property rights by doing some kind of physical damage to it or polluting it, then you can take them to court and sue them.
But it wouldn't be violating. Okay, that wouldn't be violating property rights, but I get what you're saying. So then someone would own the river,
or at least part of the river.
And that's who it would. Does this not make you feel at all like, oh, that's a little silly? Genuinely,
Why
like
is
that's
it
like,
silly?
oh, that world sounds perfect. Where like I walk into a doctor's office and have no clue, like I'm gonna have to interrogate / investigate this doctor to make sure they actually know what they're talking about, because there's no, state body that's giving them a certificate that recognizes they have the proper amount of knowledge.
No, there can be certification, but it doesn't have to be done by the state. I mean, there already are things. I don't know if the Better Business Bureau is one of them. There could be rating agencies, consumer reports, things like Yelp. You can have all kinds of mechanisms where you're rating things, so you don't have to become an expert in whatever field it is. You can just look for, does someone have this stamp of approval from this body that's been around for decades and has acquired reputation for, saying someone is a legit business person in whatever field they are. Then just like with McDonald's, I mean, that's a brand that's been around for decades. And when you see you're going to McDonald's as opposed to, Joe's Crab Shack, and you have no idea who Joe is, you might have more confidence because the brand has been around for decades. They've sold billions of hamburgers, as they announce on their sign out there. And likewise with going to a doctor, you see this guy's been to Harvard Medical School. Harvard's been around for centuries. You acquire a reputation over time, so you don't have to become an expert in the field yourself, but you can look for indexes of expertise, such as where someone's been to school, whether they've been licensed by some board. Doesn't have to be a state board, but it could be some board that's acquired credibility over a long amount of time.
I mean, a great example of this is, again, the 2008 crisis. There were private rating agencies that were rating them not very accurately, causing people to get loans that weren't at all what they should be getting a loan for. So I don't know. I just think, to me, this is the same vibe I get from communists when I talk with them. It's like every problem, just because it's a fun hypothetical world, would have a magical solution. When you look at like an example of a market operating just in a free way, people, not saying it's completely a free market, but I'm saying the free aspects of it still open the market up to massive problems that can only be solved through the societal body that we call government, that kind of has ultimate authority over the private sector. So it's like, not ultimate authority, but you get my point, is able to regulate the private sector. And so it's like assuming that all of these things that went bad that caused us to create regulations for them just wouldn't happen because it's a magical, sorry, not that word, it's a fun hypothetical objectivist world, is super naive to me. It's the same reason like communists think that everything will just work, even though it time and time again hasn't. It's the same vibe I get from you.
Yeah, I don't buy that this is just a complete fairy tale sort of system. I mean, I think history bears it out. The more free countries there have been have done better than the less free countries. North Korea versus South Korea, East Germany versus West Germany, Soviet bloc versus the Western bloc. United States in the 19th century, I think, was growing very well, and there was tremendous progress in that area. In that era, tons of inventions. You had, it was so horrible that millions of people from Europe were immigrating here.
Again, that's like the most black and white understanding. Either you're completely free or completely oppressed and under an authoritarian state. Yes, I agree that North Korea is worse than in the way that people are treated than all the Western countries. But also going all the way in the other direction isn't necessarily the solution. Like, let's have absolutely nothing or an authoritarian government. Like, that's our two options.
Well, there are certainly degrees, but I'm saying the more free a country is, the better it's done. And I think various examples, these countries are all on spectrums. South Korea is not perfectly free, but it's, much more freer than North Korea. it's probably not as free as the United States, at least during certain parts of its history. But I think if you look at the broad sweep of history, what you find is that the freer countries have done better. They've prospered more. So I don't think this is just like some detached from reality, pie in the sky fairy tale that there's no historical basis for. I think history actually backs it up, and it shows that the more you coerce, the worse things get. With like countries like Soviet Union or North Korea being at the extreme end of that spectrum.
So that I'm so happy you said coercion. I forgot to bring that back up. Okay, so I agree that more having free societies is amazing and lead to the best outcomes. It's just how are we defining free? Because I think a lot of times the more libertarian, small government, and then in your case, objectivist thinking makes you go, oh, I don't like coercion. I don't like the lack of freedom. So I want, but you only define that as the government putting that on to people. But whenever you take away completely any intervention of the government, you're going to have coercion. You're going to have the lack of freedom. It's just not going to be coming from the government. So, for example, monopolies. Why was it something very early on that people within our government established, like we should have the ability to break up monopolies? Because you see a situation where even in a wonderful free market, companies are able to consolidate so much power that they now own that industry, own that market, and no one can compete with them. Little small businesses can't even try. And they end up being able to, an example of this is insulin, jack up the price 10x on people. That's coercing people out of money that they should not be having to pay for a life-saving drug. And so now you're just having a company coerce you for your money instead of the government. Now it's coercion through, insulin, not taxation, but it's coercion nonetheless. So I think that's kind of where the disconnect is you're going to have a situation if you just leave all the other powers besides the government to do what they wish, where people get oppressed, people get coerced, and people lose freedom. It just isn't coming from the government.
Okay, so I think we might have a difference here on what coercion means, because I think coercion necessarily requires physical force, and that doesn't happen, in my view, when a company is simply making a trade. Maybe you don't like the terms of the trade. Maybe you think it's they're charging too much for whatever they're proposing to trade you. But if they're not using physical force, if they're not threatening you, then they're not coercing you. So sometimes an example that I like to use is islands cases. I don't know, maybe you've heard some of these. Vosh has his coconut island example, is just kind of vulgar, so I won't use exactly that. But if I'm on an island, or both of us are on an island, and I've got some food supplies and you don't have anything, and I say, I'll give you some of my food if you do something really distasteful, or like eat worms or something. We can make it less vulgar than Vosh's. Or if you just if you do jumping jacks for a week straight and you just do nothing else, I'll give you one coconut if you do that. Am I coercing you? I don't think so. I think you could say I'm a nasty person for making such an offer, but I'm not coercing you. I think I would be coercing you if I threatened you with a stick or something. I was threatening to beat you, or if I actually did beat you, then I would be coercing you. But if I just make you an offer which you don't like the terms of, I would say that's not coercion.
So it's just force, and that then I understand your definition of coercion, and I can apply that to your previous statements. But that to me just makes it further obvious that this is an unrealistic and not logical worldview. And the reason is here, if I'm saying meaningful coercion or to me the lack of complete freedom, but let's just use coercion for a second. If it's you and me on an island, you get there after I got there, and I have all of the food, and then I say you have to work for me indefinitely, as much as I want, whatever I want you to do, if you want me to feed you. I'm the only person who can give you food. I'm not threatening you with violence, but you're gonna die if you don't have my food. So it's
Maybe.
like, what do you mean maybe? What you
I mean,
gonna
I
do?
could
Eat
fish
the
for
sand?
myself. Imagine I'm the only one there myself. If I'm there myself and there's no one else, I'm going to have to do something. Now, maybe if you're also there and you've been there for longer and you've already found a way to support yourself, you can make it easier for me by offering me a trade. But the default is me versus nature. It's man alone versus nature. So, I can take my own risks and I have to take my own risk if they're all alone, but I'm not being coerced. What if I'm there just by myself? There's no one else on the island. I have no choice but to try to fish or find some berries or something. Am I being coerced?
I think you missed. I'm not talking about a real situation where we're on an island. I'm saying here's an example of your only option for food is me.
But it's not.
Regardless of no. This is like when people don't.
All right,
This
go
is like
ahead.
whenever you give some hypothetical and you're like, hey, what would you do if you had one bullet and had to kill this person or this person? And you're like, I would shoot through both their heads. It's like, well, that's not the point of the hypothetical. I'm saying if we thought of a situation where I was the only person who could provide you food,
Okay.
and then the scenario I just played out, you have to come to me for food. That's the hypothetical. Then I'm not violently threatening you, but you are coerced to do what I want you to do, is in my opinion.
Why?
Okay, so you'd believe that
yeah.
you believe that wouldn't be coercion.
Yeah, if you're just making me an offer, which might be a really nasty offer, but you're not threatening force, you're not doing anything physical like harming me with a stick, then you might be a nasty person, but I'd say you're not coercing me.
Okay, and I'll completely accept that that's your definition of coercion, and that to me says for some reason you value a very unique definition of freedom and a very unique definition of not having coercion, and in such a way that you want to create a world where those things are in the place you want them to be, but that wouldn't at all be the best outcome for society. It would just somehow check the box that you want to check for no conceivable reason. Like if that's the definition of coercion and you don't want anything's fine unless it's that, then you're going to have a devastating society.
Unless it's that.
I'm saying within the coercion conversation. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, coercion is one bad thing, but it's not the only bad thing. Like I said, you might be a nasty person for making an offer like, I'm only going to give you some food, assuming you're the only one. If you have the food and you say, I'm only going to give you some of it if you eat some slugs or something, you're probably a nasty person. So that's a bad thing. Coercion is also a bad thing, but it's not the only bad thing.
Well, I'm not saying, yeah, no, I get what you're saying. It's not talking about morality. I'm just saying that from the perspective of what the government should and shouldn't be doing, if you're saying that, like, I would rather there be some level of, I think a better society is formed when you allow some level of threat of force. That's the monopoly on violence that people talk about with the government. And that yields the best outcomes. It's only if it's through a democratic society where you're able to check that government that has a monopoly on force. But I would much rather there be some level of the threat of force in life and that level of coercion than all of the other forms of coercion that I think are coercion that don't technically fall into the threat of force.
I mean, I think it's important to have a clear concept of force. And one thing that I'm concerned about is when you expand the concept of coercion in the way it seems you might want to, then a lot of things end up being called coercion that I don't think are, but then by calling them that, they become justification for doing things that I think are bad. So like if you think it's coercive for a company to charge a certain price for gasoline or food or whatever, now because we've called it coercion, now we can coerce that company into lowering their prices, or else their CEO is going to have to go to jail or whatever. So we're licensing actual coercion under the pretense that they are engaged in coercion. So that's one thing I'm concerned about here when you have this expansive concept of coercion, which is not clearly defined, and which I think is very vague. And there's not going to be any clear way. What you might think is coercive. Maybe you think it's coercive to charge, I don't know, $50 for a gallon of gasoline, but someone else thinks, oh, it's already coercion if someone charges $25, and somebody else thinks it's coercion if you charge $10. This is highway robbery. We're not going to let them get away with that. We have to, defend ourselves. And so there's no clear way to draw the line. But if you have a clear concept of coercion, which I think Ayn Rand does, which is actual physical threats of force, then you have an objective way, a principled way of settling these kinds of issues. Otherwise, it's just deuces wild.
And I'm totally fine defining coercion as whatever, as anything. So if it's, for the purposes of this conversation, if we just want to say it's the threat of force, is that what you said? The threat of force or physical force? That's fine. And that just makes it so clear, in my opinion, to everyone that clearly that has to be prevalent, because all these other bad things, or has to exist. Some threat of force has to exist for a society to function. Otherwise, all these other horrible things are going to happen. And that's where kind of like, I understand why you need to define it like that, because then that's the thing you're trying to avoid in your ideal society. And I'm just saying, when it is defined as that and you're trying to avoid that, you end up in a situation where you're expecting of a person existing in society to do an inhuman amount of work on a daily basis to stay alive, to make sure that everything is safe in their life, when you could just outsource that to the societal body that we all buy into, kind of we all within the social contract buy into, that can take care of that for you, so you can live a more free life, free of the burden of having to constantly wonder if your doctor's actually certified, constantly wonder if the building is safe that you're walking into, constantly, as we go on.
I mean, I think that's a straw man position of what I'm advocating. I don't think there is a need to constantly be worried and wondering about whether the building you're in is going to fall. Just as, already there's no constant worry that, the shoes I buy are going to, the soles are going to fall off of them, even though we don't have a shoe agency like we have an federal and drug agency. I mean, there's tons of products that are not regulated by the governments. And as I said, there is the competition effect. You weed out bad actors over time. And if there is, even with that going on, you still have some bad actors trying to cut corners. These people can get caught and thrown in jail, fines. So I don't think
what would they get thrown in jail for? There was nothing they did wrong. They just cut corners. They're allowed to. They didn't violate any law.
Fraud would be a jailable or at least finable kind of offense. Like the thing about false advertising, if you say your product has 10 calories per serving, it actually has 100. That would be a form of fraud.
Right, but
and in my system,
I'm not referring to that.
You could be penalized for that. So right. I don't think there is going to be this constant need to worry about all these things without governments, regulators coercing people.
So, to be clear, kind of the difference in our two worldviews. I obviously don't think regulation is all good or all bad. I think you could over-regulate for sure. You could under-regulate. You could have too many government programs. You could have too little government programs. It's just finding that balance. And based on every real-world example, I can think up a world where you allow some government intervention outside of just the things you've outlined is a much safer, happier, healthier, even freer society, in my opinion, even if that means in a sense you're coerced to pay taxes and you don't believe that. And I think that's kind of the furthest we can go. Is there any other kind of main thing you wished to have said?
Well, just one thought on that last point is a question I would put to you or anyone who holds your sort of view is like, where do you draw the line? So you say that I think, maybe there's such thing as over-regulation, but we got to have maybe some taxes are too much, but some amount is okay. But where do you draw that line? I don't think you have a principled way of drawing those sorts of lines. And I think that creates a problem. There's no, and it can create slippery slopes as well. Like, I think taxation might be a good example here. Like when it started, people are like, it's crazy. You're going to tax us like 3%? That's crazy. We've had no taxation for decades or for maybe an entire person's life back in the 19th century. Now you want to tax us 1%? And now, look what it's up to, 30%. If you can tax 1%, why not 2%? Not just one more percent. If 2%, why not 3? Why not 4? So where does it end? If you don't have a principled way, a principled reason, then it's just subjective and arbitrary where you draw that line, and it becomes a sliding scale.
It's definitely going to be subjective, as is every prescriptive statement on how our government should operate, even thinking that being free is a good thing. Who is that objective? Well, not really. What we have to do is look at, the great thing is because we have a good amount of history in multiple different countries, as well as looking at countries in the modern day. You look at how effective current systems work right now. You look at historically how different things have gone. And then I think that's why you set up a democracy that, as much as it's annoying, operates pretty slowly. So people have a say, but because there's a lot of checks on power, you can't swing too much in one direction or another. That's why we see our government operate pretty slowly in change, in the change metric. But understanding that, like, let's say there's a spectrum between black and white. A lot of that's gray, right? Neither of us could tell you exactly when it becomes black to gray and then gray to white, but we know there's a black on one side and a white on one end, and there's a gray in the middle. So yes, of course, in the gray area, knowing exactly where that line is a constant journey. But if the best place is in that gray area, just because it's going to be a constant push and pull of, do we go more in one direction or another, doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt at all to be in that space and just go to one radical end or another. And as we've seen, programs that were fought for, that some people thought were good, some people thought bad, that have been implemented have made people's lives materially better. And that's awesome, even though, of course, you can't know for sure, especially in a democracy, how far something will be taken. Where is the tax rate eventually going to go? It's relating to the times, the available research you have on the effectiveness of a particular thing that you're proposing, and different times call for different levels of response. So back when when America was under the current sets, of conditions that it was in the time that we had lower taxes, maybe that was the best option. And then we move forward, times change, and we feel like, hey, income inequality has gotten even larger, let's tax the top a little bit more. So no, I don't think it's like objectively 5% is the number we need, or objectively 3 major government programs, or it's just, what does the moment call for, what problems need solving, and then how does that work within the democracy?
Yeah, I don't think you have any way to decide that. I think it's
democracy.
Arbitrary. No, democracy is mob rule if it means unlimited majority rule. I don't think the majority has the right to vote away the rights.
And that's why you have a constitution that sets up a situation where there's checks on power, and the majority can't just rule completely. That's like what the Senate does.
So if you have a majority, yeah. Well, I think how do you decide what the majority should be able to vote on? So, like, what if the majority wants to enslave
representatives? Representatives. They don't vote on particular issues. They vote on representatives. And if you were in a society where they did that, that would be horrible. Just like how if you were in a society that wasn't a democracy, a dictator could decide to enslave everyone. Yes, you have to have some buy-in to the concept of the Constitution that establishes that you can't violate people's rights to that extent.
Well, how about taxes? Should people be able to violate rights by taking away 80% of your income? Should that be subject to majority vote? So if majority wants to take away 80% of your income,
but within the creation of the but whenever you're establishing the country that you're going to then have people buy into, and the concept, at least in the example of America and all the countries I'm aware of, you put within that body of work that establishes what people's rights are, that it is not a violation to tax people. It does lay out that Congress has the power to tax.
Yeah, that's part of the original Constitution, Article 1. I think Congress has the power to tax, and I think that's a problem. But I don't think just because something is allowed by a Constitution doesn't make it right. I mean, slavery was allowed by the original Constitution, but does that legitimize it? I don't think so. I think there's some
and neither does like any philosophical lens absolutely relies on or belief, people also buying into that philosophical belief. So yes, if we're in a society where people believe slavery is not a violation of people's rights, whether it's a dictator who believes that and they make it happen, or it's a democracy and they make it happen, it's going to happen. That's horrible. There's like literally no way to prevent that through any philosophical lens.
Well, there are times when pretty much everyone thought slavery was okay, and everyone would try to enslave everyone else. The concept of individual rights I think wasn't really discovered in a major way until John Locke, which was the 17th century. And then on the basis of his ideas, the founding fathers of this country set up the United States. But I think there is progress that's been made in human understanding of what a proper sort of government is. So I think, yeah, whatever philosophic ideas are common at the time, that's going to influence.
Of course, yeah, we agree on that.
Of governments that people bring into being. But I think there are objectively better and worse governments.
I agree.
And I think, looking at history and having a certain theory of ethics, we haven't talked much explicitly about ethics, but I think that's key to understanding what a proper political system would be. But I mean, I don't think it's subjective. I think it is objective as to what is a good government, sort of government to have. And I think one that has an objective concept of force or coercion is that's important, to have an objective concept of force. If you don't, I think that there's something fundamentally wrong with the sort of society you're envisioning. And it's not going to be stable either.
So unfortunately, because I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have an example of the society that you hope for, nor me. So neither of us.
Well, we have something close to the one. I think that late 19th century America is probably the closest a country has ever come to the sort of system I envision. And
the yeah, the funny thing is, in the example you said that my lens would allow for situations like slavery, and that's a perfect example of the significant oppression of black people in the time you're talking about.
No, late 19th century, this is after. Oh, there was Jim Crow.
No, so yeah, I said oppression. I know, past slavery.
Yeah.
My point is, though, let's just say because of that, because clearly that's coercion.
Slavery or Jim Crow?
Yeah, yes, both. But I'm saying, like, clearly there's parts that weren't ideal. So now we're looking at, and mine too, of course. America's not perfect now, and it's more regulated than it was before. So the only way that we could, quote unquote, objectively know which system was better is to have like defined metrics that we value. And the process of valuing certain metrics, because that's how you get to something objective, is you have to be able to measure something. And us deciding which things are valuable to measure is going to be a subjective process. So I might say I want GDP to be higher, I want unemployment to be lower. Like, what leads to those things? Or poverty to be lower, infant mortality. And you might say, well, no, those aren't the most valuable things to me. These are. So what you value is completely subjective, and that's why saying objectively this is a better society rarely works, unless it never works. That never happens.
You're raising a big issue, and I think it's an important issue, which is objectivity. Is there such a thing, or is it all subjective in the final analysis? Ayn Rand has quite a bit to say about that. Especially one place is in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She tries to give a objective theory of value in general, not just what is the proper form of government, but what is an objective value. And one way she tries to solve this is by saying that the concept of value depends on the concept of life. That's where the whole, like, there wouldn't be values without life. If there were no living things, if there were just rocks or water, air in the universe, and there weren't any living beings, there would be no values, because something that can act for the sake of things. And a rock is not acting for the sake of anything. It's not trying to do anything. But living things do try to do things. Namely, they try to live. They try to stay in existence. So this one difference between living things and non-living things is living things can they can go out of existence. So if a living organism doesn't take certain actions, if this plant doesn't turn its leaves to the sun or reach its roots out to get some water, it's going to die. But what does a rock have to do to survive? It doesn't have to take any certain action. It just has to not be impinged by certain external things, like not get pulverized by a glacier or something. but absent external forces on it, it doesn't have to do anything positively to continue in existence, whereas living things do. We have to eat. Human beings have to get shelter in certain circumstances, at least. Food, clothing, shelter, and to make their lives even better, they have to do things like build technology, create medicines. There are many things that objectively they must do if they're going to stay alive. So I think by seeing values in the context of life, that could be one way to lend some objectivity to the notion of valuing. There's much more that could be said about this, but that's just a little hint about how Ayn Rand solves this issue.
If that's true, and the core purpose of life is to stay alive generationally, so it's often to reproduce with, with animals and stuff, and so it doesn't at all compute, because I guess some people would say, no, the way that you find objective values is to look to things that exist, whether or not we're naming it and defining it. And an example of that is like the biological will to reproduce. Okay, so instantly you can understand why that's not even accurate. I don't even know if this is the point you're trying to make, but kind of see how this hits you. In a society where you were really just trying to keep the society going, you could do some horrible things to make that happen. If you were just trying to, reproduce the most, generationally exist for the longest term. This could include, prioritizing the life of people who have the best genetics and all of these things and are the most fertile, and violating other people's what we now define as rights to that end. And that's why people throughout history have believed in horrible things like forced castration and stuff like that. And so some people value a super strong, healthy, genetically genetically dominant society. And that would lead to horrible things in my value system, because I value individual rights. But that's not objective. One's not objectively better in the sense of which value is the correct value. It's just different value sets. So this is all subjective. Once we define what our values are, then you can objectively measure.
So, I mean, so you think it's in the final analysis, it is all subjective, but then here's a question. Where did you originally get the notion of good or of value? What gave rise, what experience of yours, if it was an experience, where did you originally get this idea of good? Because I think if you can answer that question, that might be a lead to finding objectivity.
Well, no, my answer will show that it is subjective. I mean, some people believe that it comes from God, but I think you can't deny it comes from the environment that you're in, the family that you're raised by. Those are where your values come from.
Hold on, with God, I don't think that can be the original source of it, because let's say you're a baby, you don't understand words yet, but you value things. I mean, you value your mother's milk. Let's say you have this experience that you enjoy,
but that's like a natural thing your body knows to do to stay alive. And I agree with you. Wanting to stay alive is a characteristic of life in nature. Well,
it doesn't even know anything about that it's alive yet, but it has pleasure. Certain things I think this actually could help provide some objectivity to the notion of values. Pleasure. So we have a biologically inbuilt pleasure pain mechanism. So we come into this world built in a certain way, such that if you eat food when you're hungry, it gives you pleasure, not pain. And if you trip on a rock and scrape your knee, it causes pain, not pleasure. there's no choice about that. That's just the way that we are built. Some things give us pleasure and some things give us pain. And I think that can provide an objective basis. And I think that's our original. I asked
But
you,
that's
where
not,
do you originally...
that's not how you define if something's good or bad. Because
Well, I think it's
people
a start,
can get
though. I'm
pleasure
saying,
out of
where do you
raping
originally
somebody.
Get the concept of, where does the original idea of good and bad come from? I think it comes from pleasure and pain. Now
My
there are
point is,
cases,
we do define what's good and bad in, societally, which makes it a subjective conversation.
Wait, we define good and bad societally. I'm
Yes.
not sure
Some
what that
groups that you're in
implies.
think some things are. For example, I've been in spaces where being gay is heavily looked down upon. It is their value system leads them to believe that is bad, and then I've been in spaces where it's celebrated. So clearly, groups define what is good, what is valuable, what is admired, based on a bunch of subjective beliefs and factors.
Well, when you say groups define, I mean, human beings are, I mean, individuals, groups are made up of individuals. So, I mean, some individual in a group can say, I don't like gays, or I do like gays. And then it's up to other individuals to also make that decision. I mean, if my next door neighbor tells me,
which is subjective.
well, wait a minute. I don't see that follows. The fact that there are different opinions, I don't think means that the nature of the opinion is necessarily subjective. Like I'm of the opinion that 2 + 2 is 4, and that the Earth is round. Now, if someone else is of the opinion that 2 + 2 is 5, or that the Earth is flat, we have different opinions. But does that mean that my opinion that 2 + 2 is 4 and that the Earth is round is subjective? I don't think so. I think I have objective reason.
But those are you're talking about measurements. Yes, and like things you can observe in the physical world. We're talking about values that are not anything you can measure.
Yes. Okay. Now going back to the pleasure pain thing, if I think that eating food when I'm hungry gives me pleasure, and now that's something I think anyone is going to experience, like regardless of who you are. This is one reason why I think going back to the pleasure pain mechanism, which is biologically, eat it too much, but if you eat it in the right quantity, it gives you pleasure.
But you're killing me, because you're saying that we can derive objectivity within our analysis of what is good and bad in society. Like, we can define what is good and bad in society and what values we should seek out, what values we value through objective measurements and through an objective worldview. And I'm saying that's impossible, and you're saying no, it's not, because we have pleasure and pain, which are like inherent, and so you can derive objective analysis from that. And I'm saying, well, no, because you can do a lot of things that feel pleasurable that are not good for you within what we define to be as good. There's a disconnect between the objective stuff that you're talking about and how we decide what is valuable and what is good and what is bad in society.
Well, I think there are many steps. Like, you can't go straight from, food gives me pleasure and scraping my knee on a rock gives me pain, to we should have a laissez-faire capitalism government. I mean, that's a huge leap. I think there are many, 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 many steps.
And you think all those steps are objective?
They can be. I mean, you can make mistakes along the way, and I think part of the process, part of the challenge of being a human is figuring out what the right steps are. And as I mentioned, like, getting to the stage of understanding what individual rights are took until John Locke, and I think even he didn't get it fully in the 17th century. He thought the rights came from God, and I don't even think there is a God. So I don't think he had a fully consistent concept of rights that was entirely coherent with a rational, logical philosophy. But I think he made a lot of important steps in the right direction, and I think Ayn Rand completed a secular understanding of the theory of rights. But humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, making all kinds of mistakes and false starts. But I think ultimately there is an objective story you can tell as to why a certain political system is objectively the best, but it's not obvious. I think it does take a lot of explanation, and you can't just go from the biological fact that certain things give you pleasure, certain things give you pain, to it immediately follows from that capitalism of the sort Ayn Rand advocates is the proper system.
Here's what happens, just so you're aware.
Yeah.
Like, this is what's happening with your ideology. When you picture, well, that's a big jump, it's because somewhere in there that you're jumping from objective to subjective. So you're thinking to yourself, I can kind of come up with these objective things, how we, crave food and we eat it and that keeps us alive, and that's kind of like a inherent process, and it's clearly a long jump all the way to objectivism, but you could get there. But I'm saying you can't get there without at some point saying, we value this because we value it, not because there's an objective measurement. You can have an explanation for it, but what is good is up to humans' decision-making, subjective view on the world. So even valuing individual rights, like let's say that you were someone trying to craft a society and you thought, I want to keep the society alive. That's why I want as many people. That's going to be the best chance for it to across generations last a long time. That's my goal. I value that. And so I'm going to have it set up where, how do I not say this in a really gross and vile way? Like, women's rights aren't respected in getting pregnant over and over to make as many babies as possible. But then I would say that's bad because I value individual rights. That would be violating the woman's individual right, to bodily autonomy. So then that's just like a subjective decision. You could think generationally bigger populations is better. I could think individual rights with smaller populations is better. There's no way you can objectively come to a conclusion about what is good and bad in society. Once you define what you're aiming for subjectively, then you can decide which measurements you'll measure and measure those objectively. So I can say I value unemployment, and we can objectively measure unemployment.
Okay. I think some things are optional. So, for example, chocolate and vanilla. I mean, you might like chocolate. I might like vanilla. I'm not going to say one is objectively better. Like, we should both like chocolate or we should both like vanilla. No, there are certain things which I think are properly individual matters, or career. You might have a passion to be an engineer, and someone else might have a passion to be a dentist. And I'm not going to say one of those is objectively better. But I will say it's objectively better to eat chocolate or vanilla rather than mud if you're a human being. Also, I will say it is objectively better to be an engineer or a dentist rather than a serial killer. So I think there are certain limitations,
but even
which
then,
you can say are objectively
I don't think we're going to
better.
get anywhere with that, because then it's like, well, why? The reason why we don't like serial killers is because violating the right to life of the people that the serial killer is killing. But valuing life and valuing not taking away others' lives is a subjective value. But we're not going to get anywhere with that. I think we have too big of a gap on this one. But I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Is there anything else you want to say? It's been a pleasure. You're fun to talk to.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. So I don't have any. I'm sure we could go on forever with this, but
yeah, feel free. We'll schedule another time at some point, because I'm sure we could do a whole nother conversation.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I should just drop a link in the chat if that's okay with you. And
I think it's every time they try to send me links, it doesn't take it. But
okay, well I can just say what it is again. My YouTube channel.
Say it, and then when I upload this to my channel as a video, I'll put it in the description.
Okay, so it's youtube.com/DanNorton1, and I'm also on Twitter at DanNorton111, so you can follow me there. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. That was awesome. I had fun. What'd you guys think? Definitely interesting. I realized on my channel I haven't actually had that many people who are like completely on the other side of the political spectrum, just because I always ask and they never come. So I was glad to hear this guy who I knew, I was glad to hear Dan reach out to me, or I was happy when he did, because he really is, so ideologically opposed, or on the other end of the spectrum. And so I was really, excited about that, because I've had heated debates like with Doug, obviously, and I guess I have had a Republican on, but even he is super moderate, so it didn't get into the meat of the stuff. So that was fun. Thanks, Matthew. All right, y'all. I am out, leaving, done with you idiots. No, I'm kidding. Love you guys. But I am leaving right now, and I'll see you tomorrow. What's today? Today's Thursday, right? So tomorrow's Friday. Sweet. I'll see you tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern.